The Ticking of the Grandfather Clock, a Miss Marple Mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with the steady, unassuming ticking of a grandfather clock, a sound that fills the quiet house of St. Mary Mead with a sense of routine and calm. Everyone assumes it is nothing more than background noise, a comforting reminder of the passage of time. But Miss Marple notices what others overlook, the moments when the ticking seems out of sync, the shadow that moves just a fraction too late, and the faint scratches on the polished wood that hint at something hidden inside. The clock, she suspects, is not just keeping time, it may be keeping a secret. As she carefully examines the clues and listens to the steady, deliberate ticking, Miss Marple realizes that what appears ordinary may hide a plan far from innocent, and that time itself may hold the key to uncovering a shocking truth. Before we uncover the secret hidden in the grandfather clock, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Ticking of the Grandfather Clock. The village of St. Mary Mead was the sort of place where time moved quietly and without hurry. The cottages stood along narrow lanes bordered by hedges, and the people who lived there followed routines that rarely changed. Morning walks, afternoon tea, and evening fires happened almost exactly the same way each day. Visitors often described the village as peaceful, though Miss Jane Marple had long believed that peaceful places sometimes hid the most curious stories. On a cool autumn evening, Miss Marple sat in her small sitting room beside the window, knitting as she often did when the day was ending. A lamp glowed softly beside her chair, casting warm light across the room while the outside world slowly slipped into darkness. The scent of fallen leaves drifted faintly through the slightly open window, and the quiet of the evening settled comfortably around the cottage. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved in steady rhythm while her thoughts wandered gently from one small observation to another. She enjoyed quiet evenings because they gave her time to think, and thinking was something she did very well. Many people in the village believed she simply spent her days gardening and knitting, but Miss Marple understood people in ways that often surprised even experienced police inspectors. After a few moments she paused and lifted her head slightly. There was a sound drifting through the evening air. It was faint at first, almost blending into the stillness, but once she noticed it she could hear it clearly. It was the steady ticking of a clock. Miss Marple listened for a moment and then gave a small knowing smile. She recognized that sound immediately. It was not the little clock on her mantelpiece, which ticked lightly and quickly. This sound was slower and deeper, the sound of an old mechanism built with careful craftsmanship. The sound came from Greystone Manor. Greystone Manor stood at the far edge of the village road beyond a line of tall trees and an iron gate that opened onto a long gravel drive. The house itself was large and built of grey stone that had darkened with age. Its windows were tall and narrow, and the front door opened into a wide entrance hall that echoed with footsteps. Inside that hall stood one of the most famous objects in the entire village, a tall grandfather clock. The clock was an impressive piece of work made from dark polished wood. Its brass clock face shone whenever light touched it, and behind a glass panel the long pendulum swung slowly back and forth. The movement of that pendulum produced the deep, steady ticking sound that could sometimes be heard outside the manor on quiet evenings. The owner of Greystone Manor, Mr. Arthur Pendleton, was extremely proud of that clock. He was a quiet and private man who rarely spoke much about his personal life, but when the clock was mentioned he always made the same claim. According to Mr. Pendleton, the clock had never stopped running since the day it had first been placed in the house many years earlier. Some people in the village believed him while others thought such a claim was unlikely. Old clocks, after all, sometimes stopped or needed repair. But one thing everyone agreed on was that the clock kept excellent time. Miss Marple resumed her knitting and listened to the faint ticking drifting through the night air. There was something oddly comforting about the sound. A clock that kept such steady time seemed almost like a quiet witness to the life of the house around it. The following morning began as most mornings did in St. Mary Mead. Pale sunlight spread slowly across the village while shopkeepers opened their doors and early walkers greeted one another along the lanes. The baker arranged fresh loaves in his window, and the scent of warm bread drifted pleasantly through the street. Miss Marple left her cottage after breakfast for her usual walk through the village. She carried a small basket on her arm and moved at an unhurried pace, observing the familiar surroundings with quiet interest. She believed that careful observation was the key to understanding many things in life. As she approached the village shop, she noticed Mrs. Harper walking quickly toward her. Mrs. Harper was a cheerful woman who had a remarkable talent for discovering news before anyone else in the village. Her expression that morning suggested she had something important to share. "Miss Marple." Mrs. Harper called as soon as she was close enough. Miss Marple stopped and greeted her with a polite smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper. Have you heard the news?" Mrs. Harper asked eagerly. "I'm afraid I haven't," Miss Marple replied. "What has happened?" Mrs. Harper lowered her voice even though the street was nearly empty. "It's Mr. Pendleton from Greystone Manor," she said. Miss Marple waited patiently. "The gardener found him this morning," Mrs. Harper continued. "He was lying on the floor in the entrance hall." Miss Marple's expression remained calm as she listened. Mrs. Harper hesitated for a moment before finishing her sentence. "He's dead." For a short moment neither woman spoke. Although Mr. Pendleton had not been a very social man, his death still felt like a serious event for the village. "How very sad," Miss Marple said gently. "Was the doctor called?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Harper replied quickly. "The doctor thinks it may have been his heart. They believe he collapsed during the night." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And he was found in the entrance hall, you say?" "Yes," Mrs. Harper said. "Right beside that big grandfather clock of his." Miss Marple thanked her for the information and continued walking, though her mind had begun quietly arranging the details she had heard. Later that afternoon, curiosity led her toward the road that passed Greystone Manor. The tall iron gate stood partly open, and a motorcar from the county police was parked near the entrance. Inspector Dalton stood nearby speaking with the gardener. Miss Marple paused outside the gate for a moment before the inspector noticed her. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said with polite familiarity. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she replied. "I suppose you've heard about Mr. Pendleton," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple answered. "A very unfortunate situation." Inspector Dalton nodded. "The doctor believes it was natural causes. It appears he collapsed in the entrance hall sometime during the night." Miss Marple glanced toward the open doorway of the manor. "The entrance hall," she repeated quietly. "Yes," the inspector said. Miss Marple hesitated before asking her next question. "And the grandfather clock, was it still running when he was found?" Inspector Dalton looked slightly puzzled by the question. "Yes, it was still ticking," he said. "Just as it always does." Miss Marple folded her hands together thoughtfully. "How interesting." The inspector studied her expression with curiosity. "I'm not sure I understand," he admitted. Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "Clocks are very honest things," she said quietly. "They record time exactly as it passes." She looked once more toward the silent entrance hall of Greystone Manor where the tall clock stood. "If something unusual happened during the night," she added calmly, "that clock may know more about it than anyone else." With that she turned and began walking slowly back toward the village. Inspector Dalton watched her leave, unsure what she meant. But Miss Marple already had a feeling that the steady ticking of that old clock might reveal a story far more interesting than a simple accident. And she intended to discover exactly what had happened inside Greystone Manor during the quiet hours of the previous night. Chapter 2: The Secrets Kept by the Clock. The following morning the village of St. Mary Mead was far quieter than usual. News of Mr. Pendleton's death had spread quickly, and although people spoke about it in calm voices, the event had unsettled many of them. Greystone Manor had always seemed like a distant and silent place, but a death inside its walls brought it suddenly into the center of everyone's thoughts. Miss Marple, however, did not concern herself with gossip. She had spent many years observing the behavior of people, and she knew that rumors often distracted from the truth rather than revealing it. Instead, she focused her attention on the small details she had already heard. A man had died beside a clock. A clock that was said to have never stopped. That fact lingered in her mind as she sat by the window of her cottage that morning, turning the matter over carefully in her thoughts. She had learned long ago that the simplest explanation was not always the correct one, especially when human nature was involved. By late morning Inspector Dalton returned to Greystone Manor to continue his inquiries. The doctor had confirmed that Mr. Pendleton had indeed died during the night, though the exact time was uncertain. The body had been found lying on the polished floor of the entrance hall directly beside the tall grandfather clock. The inspector walked slowly through the house, making notes and speaking with the few people who had regular contact with the owner. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lane, arrived each morning shortly after 8. When she entered the house that day she had discovered Mr. Pendleton lying near the clock. She had immediately called the gardener, who then contacted the doctor and the police. Inspector Dalton asked her several questions about the previous evening. Mrs. Lane explained that she had left the house at 6 o'clock, as she always did. Mr. Pendleton had been in good health at that time and had mentioned nothing unusual. He always followed the same routine, she explained. After dinner he would sit in the study and read for a few hours. At 9 o'clock he wound the clock in the hall. He never forgot to do that. Inspector Dalton made a note of this detail. "You're certain he wound the clock every night?" he asked. "Oh yes," Mrs. Lane replied firmly. "He was very particular about it." After speaking with her, the inspector moved into the entrance hall where the clock stood. The grandfather clock was indeed impressive. It towered above him with its polished wooden case and shining brass dial. The long pendulum swung behind the glass panel in slow and perfect motion. The ticking filled the quiet hall with steady rhythm. Inspector Dalton studied the floor where Mr. Pendleton had been found. There were no signs of a struggle and nothing appeared disturbed. If the doctor was correct, the man had simply collapsed. Yet the inspector could not quite shake the memory of Miss Marple's thoughtful question. Was the clock still running? Of course it had been running. It was running now. Still, he stood there for several minutes, watching the pendulum swing back and forth as though it might reveal something if he stared long enough. Later that afternoon Miss Marple happened to pass the manor again during one of her walks. Inspector Dalton noticed her and approached with a polite nod. "You seem interested in this matter," he said. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I have always found that unusual events deserve a little curiosity." The inspector hesitated before speaking again. "You asked about the clock yesterday," he said. "May I ask why?" Miss Marple considered her answer carefully. "Clocks tell us something very important," she said. "They tell us exactly when things happen." Inspector Dalton nodded slowly. "That is true." Miss Marple continued speaking in her calm, thoughtful voice. You mentioned yesterday that Mr. Pendleton was believed to have collapsed during the night. But night is a rather large stretch of time. A clock, however, measures each moment very precisely. The inspector began to understand her point. You mean the clock might help determine when he died? Possibly, Miss Marple replied. Though that depends on whether the clock behaved exactly as expected. Inspector Dalton frowned slightly. What do you mean? Miss Marple glanced toward the house. You said the clock was still running when Mr. Pendleton was discovered. But sometimes a clock can stop briefly if it is disturbed. The inspector looked thoughtful. You believe he might have struck the clock as he fell? It is possible, Miss Marple said. Inspector Dalton returned inside the manor a short time later and examined the clock more closely. The case was sturdy and showed no obvious damage, but he did notice something curious. The clock had been wound recently. Yet according to the housekeeper, Mr. Pendleton always wound the clock at 9 o'clock in the evening. If that routine had been followed, the clock should still have had several hours of power remaining by morning. The inspector stepped back, thinking. If Mr. Pendleton had collapsed late at night, the clock should have continued ticking without interruption. But if something had interfered with it? The thought lingered uncomfortably in his mind. That evening Miss Marple sat once again in her cottage with her knitting, though her thoughts were far from peaceful. The more she considered the situation, the more convinced she became that something about the story did not quite fit. People often assumed that old age brought forgetfulness. But Miss Marple's mind remained wonderfully clear, and she had learned to trust her instincts when small details refused to settle comfortably. She thought about the clock again. About its steady movement. About the claim that it had never stopped. If that clock had truly been disturbed during the night, then it might have revealed the moment when Mr. Pendleton fell. And if someone had been present at that moment? Miss Marple set her knitting aside and looked thoughtfully toward the dark window. Somewhere inside Greystone Manor the grandfather clock continued its slow work, marking every passing second with calm precision. Time never hurried. But it never forgot either. And Miss Marple had a strong feeling that the truth hidden inside those quiet hours would soon come to light. Chapter 3: The Truth in the Ticking. The morning after Miss Marple's discussion with Inspector Dalton arrived quietly in St. Mary Mead. The village seemed calm on the surface, yet beneath that calm there was a growing curiosity about the strange circumstances at Greystone Manor. People continued their daily routines, but the story of Mr. Pendleton's sudden death remained on everyone's mind. Miss Marple, however, was not interested in gossip. She had spent the evening before thinking carefully about the details that had been uncovered. The stopped clock, the gardener's early arrival, and the exact time showing on the dial all pointed toward a very specific moment during the previous night. Shortly after 9 o'clock. That fact alone told Miss Marple something important. Mr. Pendleton had been alive long enough to wind the clock, which he always did at 9. Yet the clock had stopped shortly after that moment. Something had happened almost immediately afterward. Something sudden enough to stop the pendulum. Later that morning Miss Marple walked once again toward Greystone Manor. The air was cool and still, and the tall trees surrounding the house stood motionless in the pale sunlight. Inspector Dalton was already there, standing near the entrance hall with several papers in his hand. When he saw Miss Marple approaching, he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I was hoping you might return. Your thoughts about the clock have been very helpful." Miss Marple smiled politely. "I'm glad to hear it, Inspector." They stepped together into the entrance hall where the tall grandfather clock stood exactly as it always had. The pendulum swung behind the glass panel with slow and steady movement, and the soft ticking filled the quiet space. Miss Marple paused beside it and looked thoughtfully at the clock face. "It is a very reliable clock," she said gently. Inspector Dalton nodded. "Yes, the gardener told me he has rarely seen it stop." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Which means that when it did stop, something unusual must have happened." Inspector Dalton looked toward the place on the floor where Mr. Pendleton had been found. "You believe he struck the clock when he fell?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The impact could easily have stopped the pendulum." The inspector considered this for a moment. If the clock stopped at that moment, then the time on the dial would show when he collapsed. "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. Inspector Dalton paced slowly across the hall as the final pieces of the puzzle began forming in his mind. The gardener said the clock showed a little after 9 when he arrived in the morning. He assumed it had simply stopped and started it again. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Which means Mr. Pendleton most likely died shortly after 9 o'clock. The inspector stopped walking. That would place his death very early in the evening." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "Much earlier than everyone first believed." Inspector Dalton now understood the significance of that discovery. If Mr. Pendleton had died shortly after 9, it meant something very important. Someone could have been with him at that time. The inspector spoke slowly. "Mr. Pendleton was known to live quietly, but that does not mean he had no visitors." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Indeed. And people sometimes visit at times when they prefer not to be noticed." Inspector Dalton reviewed the notes he had collected during his investigation. "There was one visitor yesterday evening," he said at last. Miss Marple looked at him with interest. "Who was that?" "The village solicitor, Mr. Leonard Briggs," the inspector replied. "He stopped by the manor shortly before 9. According to the gardener, he left around that time." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though her eyes showed quiet understanding. "That is very interesting." Inspector Dalton continued speaking. "Mr. Briggs told me he was discussing business matters with Mr. Pendleton. He claimed he left before 9 and that Mr. Pendleton was perfectly well when he departed." Miss Marple looked again at the clock. "But if Mr. Pendleton died shortly after 9, she said softly, then Mr. Briggs must have been the last person to see him alive." Inspector Dalton nodded slowly. "And if something happened during their conversation?" Miss Marple finished the thought gently. "Then Mr. Briggs may know far more than he admitted." The inspector's expression became serious. "I believe I should speak with him again." Later that afternoon, Inspector Dalton visited the solicitor's office in the village. When he mentioned the stopped clock and the exact time of Mr. Pendleton's death, Mr. Briggs became noticeably nervous. Under further questioning, the truth began to emerge. Mr. Briggs had indeed remained at Greystone Manor longer than he first claimed. The two men had argued over financial matters involving the estate. The argument had grown heated, and in the struggle that followed, Mr. Pendleton had fallen backward beside the clock. His body had struck the wooden case hard enough to stop the pendulum. Panicked by what had happened, Mr. Briggs had quickly left the house without reporting the incident. He had hoped the death would be mistaken for a natural collapse during the night. Unfortunately for him, the clock had recorded the exact moment of the fall. When Inspector Dalton returned to the village later that evening, he stopped by Miss Marple's cottage to share the news. "You were right once again," he said with admiration. "The clock stopped at the moment Mr. Pendleton fell." That single detail exposed the entire story. Miss Marple smiled gently as she resumed her knitting. "Clocks are very honest witnesses," she said. Inspector Dalton laughed quietly. I suspect I will never look at a clock the same way again." Outside, the evening settled peacefully over St. Mary Mead. Lamps began glowing in cottage windows, and the familiar quiet returned to the village lanes. Inside Greystone Manor, the grandfather clock continued its steady work, its pendulum swinging calmly as it counted each passing second. Time moved forward just as it always had. But now the truth had been heard within its steady ticking. And thanks to Miss Marple's careful attention to the smallest detail, a mystery that might have remained hidden had finally been solved. If you enjoyed this Miss Marple mystery and would like to hear more stories of clever observations and hidden truths, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with fellow mystery lovers. There are always more secrets waiting to be uncovered in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead.